Jo Coburn keeping you up to date on BBC Two, Politics Live.
Should political leaders join picket lines? Is this the time to drill for more oil and gas? And why do we believe in conspiracy theories? This is Politics Live. On the programme today, Labour MP Siobhan McDonagh, Conservative MP Matt Warman, the writer and academic Naomi Klein and Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley. Today,
we've just heard from our political team that the Rosebank development, oil and gas development off the west of Shetland, has just been approved.
A new North Sea oil and gas field gets the go-ahead.
It's an existential challenge for the political and cultural institutions of the West.
Migrants put pressure on borders around the world, but is the Home Secretary right?
Resist, defy, do not comply.
And why can conspiracy theories be so attractive? Let's start with this story covered in the Financial Times. The US President Joe Biden joined striking auto workers on Michigan picket line. President appears to back union demand for a 40% pay rise. Let's just have a listen.
You deserve what you've earned, and you've earned a hell of a lot more than you're getting paid now. Thank you very much.
So he makes history, being the first US president to join striking workers in solidarity, as he puts it. Siobhan, should political leaders join workers on the picket line?
I think there's no hard and fast rule. I think often in the case of the trade unions, they have an industrial issue that they're trying to resolve. So maybe they should be the determining factor as to whether they want a politician on their picket line or not. For me, it would depend on what the issue was.
Yeah, a politician is one thing, but what about political leaders? I mean, Keir Starmer did make quite a lot of saying that if any of the shadow cabinet were to join picket lines, they'd no longer be in the shadow cabinet.
I think that what we want to concentrate on is getting a Labour government. So really the whole picket line thing is a bit of a sideshow to it all.
Matt, should political workers do what Joe Biden has done and join workers on the picket line, being the champion of the working class, as he said?
So I think for leaders in this country, certainly, it should be about leading. It shouldn't be about protesting. And Joe Biden can make up his own mind for America, but certainly in this country, I think if you're a political leader, your job is to lead, it's not to protest. And that has to be the guiding principle. And it's not. Siobhan says it's a sideshow to some of the Labour Party issues. It's not. It's a fundamental question of whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the public in resolving these issues, or are you on the side of trying to get people 40% pay rises, 35% pay rises?
I am sorry, but that, if you ask most people, do they think the nurses and the doctors and the hospital staff have a point? They would say yes.
And the pay review bodies that the government has supported agree with that?
Do they want their treatment challenged? No, of course they don't. So there are real issues there. The idea that there is always one side of the argument to fall on, it doesn't take into account the real concerns that people have.
And that is the thing you should be weighing up.
It's so interesting that you use the slogan, which side are you on? Because that's one of the slogans of the Labour movement. You really do have to choose which side you're on. Are you on the side of the workers, or are you on the side of the bosses who are making these record profits and haven't been sharing? I think what Biden did actually is, it is historic. It's very important that he stand with workers, but not just in these symbolic acts. And part of the tension with the Democratic Party is they're very good at the symbolic act, taking the knee and in those moments. But what are they going to follow up with in terms of policy? And the good thing is that Biden has some power right now because he's passed, and Congress has passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is this historic public investment, particularly in green infrastructure. And so something he could do is he could tie that investment to union jobs. And that's how he's going to get that union support. They haven't endorsed him yet. They're waiting to see whether he's really going to follow this up with real policy.
What do you think, Tim? Should political leaders join workers on the picket line? Does it show leadership?
I have absolutely no objection to it, and I'm surprised I'm the only person who's so straightforward about this on the panel. In this country, it's complicated because if your Prime Minister and the doctors or nurses go on strike, then, of course, you're not just governing in the interests of doctors and nurses, but also taxpayers and patients. So it's a difficult calculation to make. In the case of the United States, where both Democrats and Republicans are fighting for the votes of unionized workers, there's a tension between Republicans, Trump, whose whole take on being pro-worker is, I'm going to save your job, versus Democrats whose whole take on being pro-worker is, I'm going to make your job better paid and give you better health care. Both, I think, run up against the fact that the problem of many of those jobs are now disappearing. And in the case of Joe Biden and the UAW and the car strike in America, well, one of the tensions at the heart of this strike is the worry that with electrification and automation, people's jobs are going to be lost. And of course, going green is something that Joe Biden is in favour of. But also, it's an economic change you can't halt. We're seeing that with Port Talbot and what the government trying to make sure that some jobs are saved in the transition in Wales. But again, jobs are going to be lost in part of the process of going green.
It's important when you're spending hundreds of billions of public dollars that you use your full executive authority to put strings attached and say the green jobs need to be union jobs. And he has a chance to do that.
Well, talking along these sorts of lines, a big decision has been made today. We've been waiting for it. BBC News headline here says Rosebank oil field given the go-ahead by the regulator. Yes, will be allowed now to drill, develop and produce oil and gas at the Rosebank site just off the coast of Shetland. The government's made the argument that the decision is the right one on the grounds of energy security as the sector makes the transition to net zero. But, of course, there is huge opposition to it, and it will undoubtedly pose further questions about the government's commitment to its net zero target and policies following Rishi Sunak's statement last week. Is it the right decision, Naomi?
I think it's a horrific decision. I don't think that the UK is unique in approving new fossil fuel infrastructure at the very moment when we need a just transition to the next economy in the face of the accelerating climate crisis. Do we remember summer? I'm here from Canada on book tour, and my country is still partially on fire, and it's just extraordinary that this oil field, which is, it's not like some small insignificant thing. This oil field represents, by one statistic, the combined emissions of the 28 lowest emitting countries. So this is a very big deal. It's the exact opposite direction. It's an act of environmental vandalism.
Right, well, it's an act of environmental vandalism. It's horrific. It's horrific, says Naomi.
I disagree, but I think I would simply say that this transitional process requires some necessary evils, and those necessary evils do have some economic upsides, but they are necessary to get through that transition. And this is simply about pragmatism. It's not, you can't afford to be ideological.
When you transition, you're going in the opposite direction. So
yes, but there is obviously a requirement for some of this in that transitional process, and I would rather it came from the UK rather than is imported
this oil
from
going to
other
stay
places.
in the UK? Because I've heard the investors say it's going on the open market, and most of it will go to Europe. So this isn't even an energy security.
Well, I think no one's suggesting that it is going to be wholly ring-fenced for the UK market, because that's not how these markets work. But it is a part of a transitional thing, and of course it's a part of the UK's energy security conversation, which we know is important post-Ukraine and all the rest of it.
Is it the right decision, Siobhan, to grant a licence for more fossil fuels?
I think right at this moment, yes, because transition means that you have to have the things in place to allow for other sorts of energy. If we want to keep the lights on and the heating on in our homes until we get to net zero, we've got to have a transition period. And while the government always seems to want to produce headlines, there are very few plans to make sure we maximise other forms of energy. And I think it is really important that we're going to be reliant on gas for some time. Yeah. And I think it's important that we have it in the UK rather than importing it from other countries in diesel-fuelled ships. And that is the reality.
Right, so you're in favour of this. Were you in favour and supportive of Rishi Sunak's announcements last week when he postponed and delayed some key targets, including stopping the sale of petrol and diesel cars?
Well, I think what Rishi Sunak is trying to do is provide a political dividing line rather than to do anything about the issues of net zero. So it
but
seems
you
to
agree
me,
on the substantive here about
But what we're
continuing with a
talking
decision that the
about-
Greens have said Labour could stop.
What we're talking about is 20% of cars. So rather in 2030 we have 20% of cars that are hybrid, he suggests that they should be able to be they should be able to be petrol or diesel. So we're talking about very slim margins here. And the problem is we don't have a plan, unlike Joe Biden, who is doing a great job in bringing to states reliant on old forms of fuel production, on old heavy industry, finance to allow for the green jobs. So we're seeing, through subsidy, so we're seeing European companies get huge contracts in America and opportunities for jobs. You know, we talk about economic growth as if it is some sort of unicorn. We know how we produce it, and that's by investing in green alternatives, but they will take time, and in the meantime we've got to keep the lights on.
America's also, of course, been doing fracking in the last decade or so, which Britain has not been doing. I find listening to you two so fascinating because it confirms my suspicion that by giving that speech last week, Rishi Sunak saved Keir Starmer the energy of having to give it next year when he's Prime Minister. Because that's just where we are. It's a myth that Britain has not gone green. We have decarbonised very, very fast. We're a world leader on that. We've been hitting our targets. We've done it in large part by switching from coal and oil towards gas. Now we're coming to the really difficult bit, which is where we have to change consumption and the way that people actually live. And that costs money. And what the government realised was that, first of all, the targets set by Boris Johnson were unrealistic. They had been set extra early so that we could say we were going to do them faster than the EU, which is ridiculous. It was a sort of a faux Brexit dividend. So it was partly about that. But it was also they ran the numbers. Oh, yeah, but it's the kind of leadership where you just pull something out of the hat. And Boris Johnson was forever saying that going green would actually make money. It doesn't. It costs money. And it costs consumers money.
Well, answer that point, that when the crunch comes and when it's going to hit people in their pockets, when they have to change their behaviour, then politically, maybe not all of a sudden, politicians think, maybe we'll slow it down.
This is a new infrastructure project. So if you're building new infrastructure project, all of it takes time. It's not turning on the lights for anybody tomorrow. All of this is, the reason why we have to focus on new infrastructure is that when investors make these decisions, it only pays off. These are multi-billion-dollar investments. It only pays off if it stays in production for decades into the future, which is why this is not the transition we need.
Everyone agrees with that.
Down.
Everyone agrees with that. We're just not ready to do it by 2030. So why not wait 5 more years? When you consider the small amount that Britain is contributing towards carbon compared to where India's going or China's going, as Tony Blair said a few weeks ago, it is not fair to punish the middle class and make them pay for that transition.
And design better
when China and India are doing that, it would make more sense. It would make more sense to finance India and China transitioning, the West giving money to the developing world to change, than it would just to try to squeeze out of us these little bits of money, which would make very little difference to the world's overall carbon production.
Well, or is it just political? Is it just political? Let's have a look at this tweet from Net Zero Watch. A reference Rishi Sunak's big net zero announcement last week has been responded to warmly by voters, with Delta poll showing a significant swing to the Tories. We can debate the figures, but anyway, broadly, a swing to the Tories over the past 10 days, with Labour down 3 points and Mr Sunak's party rising 5 points compared with their previous poll. That's all this is, isn't it? It's politics. It's desperate politics by a government that feels it's on the ropes. Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak. Well, hang on. Rishi Sunak. Well, this is the response. It's sort of worked. Actually, it isn't quite as big as that, the swing, but it sort of worked politically.
No, I think what you're doing is saying that something that is, as this indicates, has some political popularity. You're implying that makes it the wrong thing to do. That's quite the opposite. This is the public recognising that this is a Prime Minister who understands their concerns. One of their key concerns is getting to net zero, but wants to do it in a pragmatic and sensible. Yes, he is going to allow us to continue to eat meat and go on holiday. I mean, that's not unrealistic.
Unless your government
exactly.
Because
but
he's been in power since 2010.
But the point is that this is about a package of measures that seeks to deliver both that 2050 target and does it in a way that, as Tim says, doesn't punish people for, in a constituency like mine, simply living off the gas grid. That's not realistic and it's not fair.
There are real solutions to the crises that we're talking about. If people are having trouble paying their energy costs, you can subsidize their insulation. If people are having trouble paying for transportation, you can subsidize the tube. There are a lot of things that you can do that are going to lower emissions and lower people's day-to-day costs.
We can't afford it. Joe Biden can. That's America. It's got the economy. It can borrow. It can do it. It can do that. We can't do it.
This new drilling project is being publicly subsidized. It's not as if with tax breaks, it's not as if no money is being spent. I think it's being spent on the wrong things. And I think when you don't have real offers for the concerns of voters, you have to offer them these kinds of distractions. We're going to make you feel better than migrants. We're going to make you feel better than the rich people in the cities. And these are just sort of counterfeit responses to real problems. And no, it's not keeping the lights on.
A family-size electric car that can actually go real distance before stopping, you're looking into at least into the over £20,000 mark. People can't afford that.
Well, but Tim, what's interesting, and perhaps the gap between reality and rhetoric when it came to what Rishi Sunak was talking about last week, is that car makers will still face fines of up to £15,000 per vehicle. I think Siobhan was alluding to it from next year if fewer than 20% are, well, 22% then a zero emission. I mean, if he really was delaying the sort of push to net zero, why wasn't that pushed back as well?
Because he is delaying it, but he's not stopping it. This is all he's doing, and I agree with that. I'm pro net zero. I'm pro decarbonising.
Okay.
It's just we were about to reach the end of a road whereby middle-class consumers can be told, right, go and buy a heat pump, go and change your car. They couldn't afford it.
But Tim, unless we do invest in the future, we will never grow, we will never catch up. So unless there is an attempt to harness the new industries, harness the new jobs, they will just go somewhere else.
I mean, Joe, you talked about this being politically an issue for the Tories.
Off the back of the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election, which the Tories won on the issue of the ultra-low emissions zone.
Well, partially, yes. What you hear from Labour, though, is a pretence that we're not investing huge amounts of money in green jobs. Go to the Humber, go to a constituency like mine, see where those jobs are being created. So it's a fiction to say that we're not doing it. We're simply doing, as Tim says, a pragmatic pace on a vital issue.
It's message and tone as well, of course, and leadership, as Naomi was talking about. What's interesting, though, Siobhan, is Labour's reaction and your reaction to the Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan's extension of the ultra-low emission zone. I know this is about air quality, but you weren't massively in favour of that expansion because politically it cost votes, as it did in that by-election.
No, I'm really sorry. It's not about losing votes. You know, for me, it's about the people who come to see me who are really struggling. Outer London is an entirely different country to inner London. We don't have access to the public transport. We have a whole system of small businesses relying on their cars and their vans in order to do their job. We have a deficit in social carers who are really going to be challenged by being charged £12.50 a day in order to drive between their social care clients, the elderly people that need their support. And for me, as a Labour MP, we're not normally in favour of a regressive tax. By that I mean a tax not on the middle class, but on the poorest.
I can see this being used in a Tory election broadcast against Sadiq Khan. That's one of the best arguments against ULEZ I've heard.
I think I completely
viewing.
understand why Sadiq would want to bring in policies that clean the air and clean our air. What I'm saying is for some of my poorest constituents, this is a real challenge.
We're going to talk about Naomi's book. It's called Doppelganger. Why is it called that, Naomi?
Well, I have one. I have somebody who I've been confused and conflated with, another Naomi writer for now about 15 years, Naomi Wolf.
She's here. We'll show the picture.
In and of itself, lots of people get confused with other people. But the reason why she seemed like an interesting case study, and she's really only a jumping off point for the book, not the subject of the book, is that she is kind of a doppelganger of her former self.
And that's Naomi Wolf we're talking about.
Yeah, in the sense that she used to be a very famous liberal feminist, worked for the Democratic Party, was an advisor to Al Gore, and now she hangs around with Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson and spins all kinds of wild theories about vaccinated people shedding on unvaccinated people and vaccinated people, vaccines causing a genocide and so on. And she is one of millions of people during the COVID era who has been drawn to these kind of fantastical theories. So I use her as my white rabbit to fall down the rabbit hole and try to understand what is going on. Why are so many people severing relationships with anything we could recognize as a shared reality?
What did you conclude? Why is it happening?
Why indeed? I think there are a lot of drivers, and I think we spend a lot of time focused on the technological reasons, looking at the algorithms and the sort of incentive structures for extreme content. You know that what gets clicks, and it's often things that are just the wildest claim, right? But I don't think it is just about the technology. I think that's real, but I think it's tapping into, frankly, some of what we've been talking about here today, where we know there are real problems. We know, I'm from Canada, there's a Canadian politician on the right who's running on a platform of Canada is broken, everything is broken. And I think when mainstream politics doesn't seem to be fixing any of the broken things, but is really arguing around the edges, then the appeal of these fantastical theories, partly the appeal is that they claim they're going to fix it. They're going to arrest all the bad guys. There's really only 5 people who are responsible for this. It's Bill Gates, George Soros, and Charles Schwab, and we're just going to get them all, Klaus Schwab, sorry, and we're going to round them up and we're going to make the Nuremberg Code great again. And that's a story about fixing things. It's a fantastical one, but it beats nothing. Claiming an oil field is a part of an energy transition to the green economy. So I'd say lots of us aren't connecting with reality, not just them.
Tim, are you connecting with reality? What about conspiracy theories?
I try. I find this phenomenon of how mainstream figures, even those who are really idolised by the left as well, go to become extreme and fringe. I find it fascinating. And you have to understand this about Woolf, that in the 90s, Naomi Wolf, she was a feminist hero because of a book she wrote about anorexia. But one of the reasons I think why people go extreme and join the fringe is money. So Woolf was, as you know, discredited academically because she wrote a book that was found to be full of false claims. And she then suddenly appears on the fringe, where she's suddenly rediscovered and finds a whole new audience. And we see this time again with figures. You think about Tucker Carlson, kicked off Fox. So what does he do? He goes on to Twitter or X, whatever it's called at the moment, and he now starts to interview Andrew Tate. And I think part of the reason why you do that is because this mirror world, as you call it, this ecosystem of extremism and conspiracy theories, there's money in it. If you can no longer make money in the extreme, you can very quickly transition to there. And not only will you be welcome, but you can say, the real reason why I was discredited was not because I was wrong, but because the people who hate you hate me. So I think that's one reason that drives this extremism. And it's a very American phenomenon. It's what has driven a lot of American religion and politics. There's a lot of money in it.
But there's plenty of it here, as Mr. Brand has shown us. And I agree that there's huge financial incentives for I call them the conspiracy influencers, not the conspiracy theorists, because there really isn't a coherent theory. They're just moving from subject to subject. But I would just say, you can't get rich off it unless people are buying, and I'm more interested in why they're buying.
Because you say the COVID pandemic was a catalyst for conspiracy theorists, and I take your point, it's not all down to technological innovation, joining people around the world who might believe some of the theories that you say are fantastical. What was it about the COVID pandemic that changed?
Oh, well, I think it was a combination of factors. We've never had a global synchronous event like that required us to separate from one another. So we all went online in huge numbers trying to find some simulation of the relationships that we were missing. And we found a lot of people found these conspiracy influencers. There's also something just about the speed of science, right? There was a gap. It was a novel virus, and it's going to take scientists a little while before they're able to say, okay, this is our plan, this is what we're going to do. And in that gap enters a lot of these folks are at the intersection of health and wellness, bodies, even Woolf, who was writing about anorexia, in her first book, or someone like Russell Brand, who's like mixing yoga and politics and wellness, entered into that gap and said, we've got the answers, buy our supplements, sign up for our seminar, and they were off to the races.
Siobhan?
I think it's the crack cocaine of immediacy. Immediately, you've got a whole framework to understand a changing world that we might not at times have a grip on. There's an easy explanation rather than the tough explanation that is more challenging. I'm sure, Naomi's point, I'm sure we as politicians have got something to do with it about authenticity and not always going for the political headline. But it's a bit like, you know, the changing relationship between young men and young women. The fact that pornography is so easily available online that people at really young ages watch it, and it's distorting our relationships. And because we've not been here before, it's very difficult for us to catch up and understand how to manage it. Like, we've got the online harm bill to try and get rid of. I just think it's a rapidly changing world, and it's really hard to put your hook in it.
Well, can you regulate it, Matt? I mean, you were a former culture minister. Is it possible to grip something of this scale and size?
So I think you can't do it all in one go, but you absolutely have a duty, not least through the online safety bill, to try and do some of it. And Tim is right to talk about following the money. When I was a digital minister, then one of the things I was responsible for was 5G during the pandemic. And of course, lots of people claiming that 5G causes COVID, attacking masts, all of that. But it was very obvious that some of them were making money off both the advertising and gadgets to try and protect you from 5G signals. That some of this stuff is very tangible. And that's the sort of thing where I think we can have a meaningful go at it.
Against 4G and 3G and 2G.
Absolutely. Yeah, there just wasn't COVID at that precise moment.
But is money the only real driver in your mind in terms of people?
No, I just say, I have to say at this point, first of all, I'm definitely against regulating it. I believe in daylight is the best form of disinfectant, and that people usually expose themselves as fools at some point along the line. But also, sometimes politicians do engage in conspiracies, dare I say. Businesses do collude with governments. Governments do go to war on the basis of flimsy ideas and things like that. And people make mistakes and they try and cover it up. Well, and in the case of COVID, I'm not wading into that conspiracy theory water myself, but I can understand why people experienced it as a conspiracy, even if it wasn't a conspiracy.
Well, it's about mistrust. Is it about mistrust, though? Mistrust that people don't believe what is being said to them by people in authority.
And that can be healthy. Mistrust can be healthy.
Well, it would put investigative journalists out of business if we suddenly just said there's no such thing as a conspiracy. And I think that we have to be very careful. You know, I call it the mirror world, because there are two sides of it, and we're reacting to each other. And when people in the conspiracy mirror world start talking about, for instance, COVID origins, and maybe it came from a lab, then that becomes unsayable on this side of the mirror, and then that drives more people. And I would say the same thing about conspiracies. I think we should say, yes, absolutely, collusion is real. We should show our work, prove it.
The lab leak is a good example, because that might be true.
Well, exactly.
And the fact that when the idea was first suggested, everyone said, no, you can't say that. That's
There's
mad
always
thinking.
A grain of truth.
And then it looked like it might be true. That's what then causes people to think, well, because you tried to shut down that conversation at the beginning, that's the conspiracy. I found the conspiracy. It's you trying to stop me from saying that. So I think sometimes we shouldn't overreact to conspiracies, because it ends up actually putting fuel on the fire.
But perhaps one of the most high-profile events or cases, Naomi, where conspiracy theorists and perhaps some disinformation moved from the sort of online space and sort of broke through the surface, were the riots, on the Capitol on January the 6th, when thousands of Trump supporters stormed Congress in a bid to thwart the certification of Joe Biden's election victory.
Based on a conspiracy theory that it had been stolen, the election.
I mean, what was your reaction to that?
Well, it also shows what, in the book I call diagonalism, which is a phrase from a couple of political scientists in the U.S., to try to understand, like, how do you end up with the QAnon shaman in his furs, who also helps people with psychedelic trips in there, right? It isn't exactly the same right that we used to know. And so it's important to understand why people are crossing over. It does arc right reliably, including in Germany, where there was an attempted coup that brought together conspiracy culture and far-right political parties. So I think it's tempting for people who consider themselves to be reality-based to sort of treat all this as nonsense. We don't need to pay attention, but they are redrawing political maps in country after country.
Could it happen here, something like that?
I think Britain is a very much less divided place than the US politically, and that division is part of what it is relied on. But we do have to be on our guard to this. Politicians have to tell compelling stories that are based in reality.
And do compelling things.
And they have to match that with the actions that go with those narratives. That's a really important part, and we're going to see a lot more of that as we come up to the election. And we're also going to see more conspiracy theories.
Right.
If I could just say one more thing, very briefly. Sean Fain, the president of the United Auto Workers, has done more to fight conspiracy culture by actually showing what it means to stand up to the real elites and fight for workers than an army of content moderators and fact checkers.
We're going to talk about something different because if you were watching Monday's programme, you will have seen a conversation about levels of male suicide between, and let's show them, the comedian Jeff Norcott and the journalist Ava Santina or Evans. Her reaction to what Jeff Norcott was saying was criticised by some on social media, and she apologised. Her comments were then discussed on GB News with presenter and contributor Lawrence Fox being interviewed by Dan Wootton, and Lawrence Fox launched a sexualised, offensive and personal attack on Ms Santina. Now, today, as we show you in the BBC News headline, he's been suspended by GB News, and the regulator Ofcom are looking into the matter. Matt, should Ofcom take more serious action against GB News?
I think GB News has got a number of Ofcom things open against them already. One of the things that Ofcom considers is there a repeat pattern of behaviour, and those and so those things get more serious.
Again, as a former culture minister, should they be taking serious action? You've just outlined they found 3 breaches of broadcast rules since GB News launched in 2021, and there are numerous outstanding investigations. Should they take serious action?
Well, I think the short answer is that Ofcom absolutely should be looking at this very seriously, but it's important to say that Ofcom is an independent regulator. It's not for MPs or to say how the media should behave, but I think we have a robust code that takes into consideration repeat offences.
Well,
we are seeing a repeat pattern, and it's right that Ofcom takes that into its consideration.
Right. Well, one of the things that could be done is Conservative MPs could stop either being presenters or appearing on the show. On the presenter side, should they be presenters interviewing other Conservative?
I think GB News has a diverse roster. Everyone from Michael Portillo to Lee Anderson to a whole host of other people are on there, just as the BBC has a diverse.
No, centre right.
That's all one party.
But they're doing a whole host of very different things.
Yeah, but does it breach impartiality? GB News was found to have breached impartiality rules in an interview with Jeremy.
And if GB News were on here, they would say that they have people from the left as well. Now that is for that impartiality is for Ofcom to judge.
Should your colleagues be appearing on GB News and interviewing other Conservative politicians?
So I've been on GB News, for instance, as a government minister and as a backbencher. I think it's right that people continue to engage with those audiences, but it is also absolutely right that Ofcom makes sure that it does that within the framework that is set up.
Siobhan?
And if I'm invited, I would go on GB News.
Presenting it?
No. Right. I've got a job, and that's being the MP for Mitcham and Morden. But I would go on and make my case about an issue. I think it's important to do that. But I don't think sitting MPs of any party should be TV news presenters.
Well,
that's not their job.
Matt, should they be? Would you be a presenter if asked?
No, I don't think I would, but I haven't been troubled with that suggestion.
No, but if they asked you, would you do it?
No, I wouldn't, because as Siobhan says, I think my approach is the same as hers, that you have a primary...
But should David Lammy not be, who's the shadow Foreign Secretary, be on LBC?
Well, that's a matter for him, isn't it? I just appreciate the point you're making.
Yes.
But I don't think
there's a
Tory
conversation
MPs should be
in defence of GB News here. I think it has self-regulated, has it not, today? Because not only has Lawrence Fox been suspended for the horrible things he said, but also I've lost count of the number of GB News presenters who've come out and said, I want nothing to do with that. So I would say this is actually a good case for self-regulation. And if someone said something appalling, heaven forbid, on the BBC, people wouldn't stop appearing on the BBC because one individual had said something, especially if it was then made clear they probably weren't welcome back. I come back, by the way, to my point about money drives this sort of extremism. If Lawrence Fox were appearing in Macbeth at the National Theatre, he wouldn't be on GB News slagging off women. He is doing it because he's been driven out of the mainstream, and he will now find a new home somewhere else. He'll be on Tucker Carlson next week, I guarantee it.
Let's talk about immigration or migration, because you will remember in the headlines at the beginning of the programme, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has been in the United States talking to a think tank in Washington, D.C. about asylum and immigration. Let's hear a little bit of her speech.
Now, I'm here in America to talk about a critical and shared global challenge: uncontrolled and illegal migration. It's an existential challenge for the political and cultural institutions of the West. Just as it's a basic rule of history that nations which cannot defend their borders will not long survive, it is a basic rule of politics that political systems which cannot control their borders will not maintain the consent of the people and thus not long endure.
Suella Braverman there. Let's talk to Katya Adler in Brussels, the BBC's Europe editor. Hello to you, Katya. You will have heard the Home Secretary there. Of course, this is a global issue. What are EU leaders doing to try and tackle it?
Well, we heard Suella Braverman just saying this is an existential problem for world leaders. And just recently, we heard the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, saying that migration could be a dissolving force for the EU. I mean, frankly, there's very little that competes with migration as an issue that divides EU member states more than anything else. You might remember the migration crisis of 2015 when Syrian refugees and other migrants sort of poured in to Europe and were on motorways. You saw one EU member state slamming the doors on another member state. And since then, there's been an attempt to reform common asylum procedures within the EU, but there's been so much bickering, it basically took until this June. And essentially what was agreed was a sort of a compromise between the frontline countries like Greece or Italy that receive the most amount of irregular migrants, but that does include asylum seekers and refugees and other economic migrants as well, in form of those people smugglers boats arriving, and other countries that receive a lot of those asylum seekers. So for Italy and Greece, for example, it was agreed by most member states who've got to speed up asylum procedures at EU borders, make it easier to deport people. Human rights organizations warn this could lead to human rights abuses. On the other hand, they've said, look, EU member states have to get better about sharing out the burden, as it's called, in EU circles. So share out the number of asylum seekers. Now, traditionally, we've seen Poland and Hungary saying, forget it, we're not taking in anybody. So the new rules would see a way where countries could pay instead of taking people. So pay into a pot to help asylum seekers at 20,000 euros per person. But because this is the EU, nothing gets decided, even when it's ostensibly decided. So it's got to pass through the European Parliament. And in the meantime, individual member states are wanting to make changes to these new supposedly agreed rules. So on the ground, it's still messy.
Right, and some countries are at loggerheads with each other, EU members, Germany and Italy. We're going to, Katya, just show some pictures while you answer from the Italian island of Lampedusa, where thousands of migrants arrived earlier this month. The war of words between those countries, how serious is it?
No, it is serious, but actually these sort of tensions never go away. It's just that we don't always look at it in the UK. We're very focused on the people smugglers' boats going from Calais to Dover, but there are rows involving a lot more people, bigger numbers of people constantly between Italy and France, for example. And don't forget the role domestic politics has to play in all of this. It's not just Rishi Sunak who promised to crack down the number of people smugglers' boats and found himself struggling with the issue. Giorgia Meloni, Italy's prime minister, who is from a hard right party, said she was going to reduce the number of boats and arrivals to Italy. And actually, in her year in government, they pretty much doubled. Germany also is under pressure. The far-right AfD doing well in the polls, largely on an anti-immigration ticket. And it's found that its coalition government, which includes the centre-left and the Greens, who normally are more sort of liberal on asylum issues, saying that they need to crack down as well. And they're deciding at the moment in Parliament whether to put extra checks on the borders with Poland and the Czech Republic, causing tensions there. So it is an unresolved issue, absolutely.
Katya Adler, thank you very much. Let's take that into account, everything that Katya said about the situation in the EU. Suella Braverman's rhetoric, language, existential challenge. We heard there that European, some leaders think it is a dissolving force for the EU. Is that how you see the issue of migration and immigration?
No, I think what Suella Braverman does is she says something big and outrageous, a bit like we were talking about earlier, to distract people from the fact that it takes ever longer to assess an asylum claim, that we spend £8 million a day on hotels because we're not processing those claims, and deportations of failed asylum seekers have dropped by 70% since 2010. I think her job is back here in the UK and actually making the system work.
Matt?
I think what you saw from the Home Secretary was, as you've just heard from Katja, the point that this is a global problem. And yes, you're right that it is government policy to process people far faster. We've made massive progress on the speed of processing in the last year alone. But the point remains that this is a global problem. It is dominating conversations around the world.
Wow.
The suggestion that it should be resolved one way or another and that the current status quo is not perfect shouldn't really be a controversial thing to say.
It's certainly a global election strategy, and I don't think it's a coincidence that she gave that speech at the American Enterprise Institute, an extremely right-wing think tank aligned with the Republican Party. This is a party that is cheering on the Texas governor who has put buoys in the Rio Grande that have saws in between them. So there's a kind of a monstrous game going on where migrants in great need are become political pawns.
I'm sorry, Eric Adams, left-wing Democrat mayor of New York, has said his city cannot cope with the rate of migration. An estimated 110,000 people have moved to New York seeking shelter. Now, it is true that some of those have indeed been put on buses by Republicans and sent there, but that only accounts for about 1 in 10 of them. A large number of people are going to New York partly because of its welfare state system, because it has a guarantee that it will provide housing for people. So it's drawing people not just from south of the border, but all over the world. And this is why the left should worry about mass migration. It undermines the welfare state. When you live in a world in which people can move much more freely, and not just for reasons, for humanitarian reasons, but for economic reasons, they will move to richer countries and they will place stresses upon services and upon the welfare system that will end up breaking them.
Fortresses, guns,
we help their countries to grow through development.
Except for this government is also cutting aid. I mean, this isn't happening. And you know, I think there is... It's really, to me, I'm not from here, it feels like a world upside down where the same government that is not responding to a truly existential crisis, which is the climate crisis, is calling migration an existential crisis to this country, as opposed to the people who are being forced to move from their homes.
Let's call people, thousands of people coming across the channel and potentially drowning. It's not just an existential crisis.
It's a human rights crisis.
It's a life and death crisis.
It's a human rights crisis. It's a hypocrisy crisis as well, because white migrants from Ukraine have not been treated like faceless problems. They have been treated like people who are fleeing war, and the war is the crisis. And the same is true in Eritrea. And there's a wild double standard.
Yes.
And I think that is also a crisis.
So stop wars, spread humanitarian rights, spread the wealth, but you don't say to people, you can all come here, because if you did that, they would all come here.
That.
The real gulf, as Labour says quite rightly, is between the government's anti-asylum seeker rhetoric, some of which I find very distasteful, and the fact that it has also allowed in record numbers of migrants. That's the real gulf. We have been running huge numbers on that.
But it is boring and it is basic, but you have to run the system properly. And if you don't run the system properly...
And you mean the system in terms of processing asylum claims?
If you were a young man, wouldn't you take it desperate for a new life? Wouldn't you get on one of those boats and come here? Because you know you can come here and disappear.
Yes.
Because the processing is so poor. And you know you're never going to get sent back because there is no real deportation. And instead, we have a Home Secretary who talks about we shouldn't, have people claiming asylum because they're homosexual, when we're talking about 1,500 people within the numbers that actually claim
and also
asylum.
Many of them coming from countries where they could be executed
Uganda,
for being
Iran,
so. But is that really defensible or defendable, whichever the word is, Suella Braverman's saying that might not count, or perhaps should not count, being gay or a woman, as a reason for claiming asylum?
I think these are obviously hugely important responsibilities that the government has to take very seriously.
Is that
but
wrong?
But on something like that, when these conventions were written, we were talking about persecution, not discrimination. And the way that their interpretation has evolved is to start talking about something fundamentally different different from that which was conceived in the 40s and 50s. So this has to be about saying, if we were to set up a system that works for the 21st century, what would it look like? And the fact that you've got every well, if every country, Siobhan, says no, you can't, then maybe you can't.
No,
well, come on.
You can't make it work. You are incapable as a government of deporting anybody.
You can.
Well, it's a very radical suggestion that your government is making to open the UN Convention, which is a legacy of the Second World War, which was adopted in 1951, I believe, as a direct response to boats of refugees coming from all over Nazi-occupied Europe and being turned away. And the world said, we are not going to do this again. And it is extremely radical in this point, precisely because of what we heard about European politics, to suggest opening that convention. The only thing that would happen is it would be radically watered down, and there would be a mass repeat of that history, even more than is already happening with the boats being allowed to go under the waves.
You've got about 25 seconds to answer this big question that she said, Suella Braverman, the basic rule of history that nations which cannot defend their borders will not long survive.
I think it's true that a nation-state is not a nation-state unless it has a border and it is effectively policed. But also I come back to, if you want a welfare state and if you want a sense of trust within society, you have to police that border so that people have faith that the money is going where it should go, rather than what I fear people are worried about now, which is the people are coming from outside.
That's all we have time for. But thank you to all of my guests for today's programme. And I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15. Bye-bye.
I keep thinking there's going to be fucking Prime Minister's questions tomorrow. God damn it. Oh well. See you tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your day.